Clara Belrose picked up the cast-iron skillet with both hands and slammed it down on the stove, so hard the whole kitchen shook. Her jaw was tight, her eyes burned. Behind her, she could still hear the laughter from the yard, the ranch hands imitating the way she walked, the way she moved, the way she took up space in a world that had never made room for her. She didn't cry, she didn't run. She lit the fire, rolled up her sleeves, and made a decision that would change Whitaker Ranch forever. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now stay with me all the way to the end, because what Clara does next will stay with you long after this video ends. The wagon stopped at the edge of Whitaker Ranch just before noon, and the first thing Clara Belrose heard when she climbed down from the seat was laughter. Not the kind that welcomed a person, the kind that measured one. She had her one suitcase in her left hand and her chin lifted just slightly, not out of arrogance, but out of practice. She had learned a long time ago that the first moments mattered. That, how a woman carried herself in the first 10 seconds, determined whether people spent the rest of the day looking for reasons to dismiss her. She already knew what they were seeing. She had lived inside this body for 29 years. She understood exactly what it looked like to strangers. A wide woman in a faded brown traveling dress, soft in all the places the frontier world considered weakness. Moving across the dirt yard with the kind of quiet steadiness that men who hadn't earned their confidence always mistook for submission. 3 ranch hands stood near the fence post. One of them, young with a sunburned neck and a smirk that hadn't yet learned humility, nudged the man next to him and said something low. The other one grinned. The third one had the decency to look at the ground, though he didn't speak up either. Clara heard the whisper anyway. She always did. Thought he was bringing home a wife. Looks more like he hired a cook from a mining camp. The young one said it. His name, she would later learn, was Pete Daly. He was 19 years old, had never gone hungry a day in his life, and had a mother back in Nebraska who would have taken a switch to the back of his legs if she'd heard him. Clara didn't stop walking. She crossed the yard with her suitcase and her steady eyes, and she let the laughter run off her like water off dry stone. She had learned that trick too. You couldn't stop people from speaking, but you controlled whether their words found a place to land. Silas Whitaker was waiting near the main house door. He was not what she expected either. The family acquaintance in Kansas, a Mrs. Hollis Crane, who had arranged the match with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped believing love was a practical thing, had described Silas as reliable, landholding, and in need of household management. She had not described the way he stood. Like something carved out of the same stone the ranch was built on. Tall, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had seen too many hard winters and decided to stop apologizing for it. He was 41 years old. He had not smiled in a very long time. He looked at Clara the way a man looks at a ledger, assessing what he'd agreed to, calculating what it would cost. She met his eyes without flinching. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. Belrose, he tipped his hat. The gesture was polite. "Nothing more. You made good time. The driver was motivated," she said. I believe he was more uncomfortable than I was. Something shifted in Silas Whitaker's expression. Not quite a smile, but the faintest suggestion that he had heard her and that she had surprised him. He cleared his throat and turned toward the ranch hands, who were still watching from various distances across the yard. "This is Clara Belrose," he said. His voice was loud enough to carry without effort. "She'll be managing the house and the kitchen. Anyone who has a problem with that can find employment elsewhere." It was not a warm welcome, but it was a clear one. She gave him credit for that. He showed her the kitchen himself, walking ahead of her through the house with the efficiency of a man who had long ago reduced domestic spaces to their functional purpose. The front room, the small sitting area that nobody sat in. The narrow hallway, the kitchen at the back of the house where 2 small windows let in the gray light of a Wyoming afternoon. Clara stepped inside and stopped. She looked at the stove first. The iron was warped along one edge, and the firebox door hung at a slight angle that told her it had been forced, closed too many times after something went wrong inside it. The grate was crusted with years of burned residue. One of the legs was propped up with a folded piece of rawhide to keep the whole thing level. She looked at the shelves, half empty, a tin of dried beans, some hardtack, a jar of lard gone pale and questionable, a sack of cornmeal with a hole near the bottom where something small had helped itself. 3 potatoes so wrinkled they were nearly decorative. She looked at the pots, they were real. Good iron, most of them, just deeply neglected. Grease and carbon built up on the outside of 2 of them, in layers that told a story. Once someone had cared about this kitchen. Then they stopped. Then enough time passed that caring started to feel impossible. Silas stood in the doorway. The previous cook left last spring, he said. One of the hands has been doing what he could. It hasn't been, he paused. Sufficient. Clara set her suitcase down by the far wall. She didn't say anything yet. She walked the kitchen slowly, opening the small cabinet under the window, checking the water barrel, lifting the lid on the cornmeal sack and looking inside with the focused attention of a woman doing a real assessment, not a performance of one. Do you have a root cellar? She asked. Yes. Is there anything in it? Some salt pork, maybe a quarter barrel of dried apples from last fall. Some onions that may have turned. I'll need to see it. She turned to face him. And I'll need to get into town within the week. There are things missing here that can't wait. Silas nodded. I'll arrange it. I'll also need the stove leg fixed properly. That rawhide's a fire waiting to happen. A pause. I'll send someone. Tonight if possible, she said. I'd like to cook breakfast tomorrow. He looked at her then. Really looked. The kind of look that wasn't cataloging her size or her dress or the way she moved. The kind that was trying to understand who exactly he had made an agreement with. All right, he said quietly. Tonight, he left her there. Clara stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, her hands on her hips, her eyes moving across every surface with the slow thoroughness of someone planning a campaign. Because that was what this was. She had walked into places like this before, places that had given up on themselves, where neglect had become the habit and the habit had become invisible to everyone living in it. She knew how to bring those places back. She knew because she had spent her whole life being underestimated. And she had learned, through years of quiet, deliberate work, that the best response to underestimation was not argument. It was evidence. She rolled up her sleeves and went down to check the root cellar. The youngest ranch hand, Elliot Crane, nearly walked into her as she came around the corner of the house. He was 18, with big ears and an open face that hadn't yet learned to hide what he felt. He looked startled, then uncomfortable, then, unlike Pete Daly, genuinely apologetic. Sorry, ma'am, he said, stepping back fast. Didn't see you comin'. No harm done, she said. He stood there for a moment, that particular awkwardness of a young man who'd been raised right but didn't know what to do with a situation nobody had prepared him for. You really gonna cook for all of us? He asked. That's the arrangement, she said. Pete says. He stopped himself. Pete says a lot of things, Clara said, not unkindly. Most people do. What do you say, Elliot? He blinked. How do you know my name? Mr. Whitaker pointed you out when we came through the yard. Said you were the one who'd been doing most of the kitchen work since the last cook left. He went a little red. It wasn't much, mostly beans and salt pork. It was enough to keep people fed, she said. That counts for something. What do you know how to make besides beans and salt pork? He thought about it. I make decent coffee. Good. Then tomorrow morning you're on coffee. I'll handle the rest. He stared at her. He stopped again. Not what? I don't know, he admitted. I thought you'd be different, she offered, I guess. Clara picked up the root cellar door and pulled it open, looking down into the dark. People usually do, she said. Come hold this open for me. I need to see what we're working with. He scrambled to help. Down in the cellar, Clara went through everything carefully. The salt pork was usable, the dried apples were good. The onions had 3 that were salvageable and 7 that weren't. There was also a small crock of rendered lard she hadn't known about, a bundle of dried herbs hanging from a low beam thyme, rosemary, something she couldn't immediately identify, and a half sack of winter wheat flour that was still good. "Who hung these herbs?" she asked, reaching up to touch the dried bundle. Elliot, standing at the top of the cellar steps holding the door, was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "the first one. The hand said she used to dry them every fall." Clara was still for a moment. Then she carefully untied the bundle and brought it up with her. "How long ago?" she asked. 7 years, give or take." She didn't say anything else about it, but she kept the herbs. That evening, while Silas sent a hand named McCready to fix the stove leg properly, Clara worked by lamplight with what she had. She made a broth from the salvageable onions and some of the dried herbs, added the last of the usable potatoes, a small portion of the salt pork, and some of the cornmeal to thicken it. She baked a small batch of bread from the winter wheat flour, working it by feel the way her mother had taught her, flour and lard, and a little salt, and just enough water, the dough coming together under her hands with a familiar weight. She had no eggs, she had no butter, she had barely enough of anything. But by 8 o'clock that night, the kitchen smelled something that hadn't been present in Whitaker Ranch for a very long time. It smelled like someone gave a damn. McCready came in to check the stove leg and stopped dead in the doorway. He was a big man, somewhere in his late 40s, with a gray beard and a permanent squint from years of working in the sun. He looked at the pot on the stove. He looked at the bed cooling on the counter. He looked at Clara, who was washing her hands at the water basin and paying him no particular attention. "That soup?" he asked. "Broth," she said. "I'll make proper soup tomorrow when I know what we have to work with." "You're welcome to a bowl if you're hungry." He didn't move. "Where'd you learn to cook?" "My mother," she said, drying her hands. She believed a kitchen was where you showed people they mattered. She cooked like it was a moral obligation. McCready made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite agreement, but was somewhere between them. He stayed for the bowl. He didn't say much while he ate. But Clara noticed the way he slowed down around the third spoonful, the way a person slows down when they've stopped eating out of habit and started eating because the food is making them feel something they forgot they were capable of feeling. When he stood to go, he paused at the door. "Stove leg solid now," he said. "She'll hold. Thank you." He nodded. He turned to go. Then he turned back. "The rosemary," he said, "in the broth." "That's what I couldn't place." "Yes," she said, "from the cellar." "Someone dried it a long time ago." McCready was quiet. "That was Eleanor's," he said. "Mrs. Whitaker. She grew it herself, over by the south fence." Said rosemary was for remembering. Clara held his gaze. "Then it's still doing its job," she said quietly. He left, and Clara stood in the kitchen alone, with the lamplight and the smell of bread, and the small, stubborn ghost of a woman she'd never met. And she felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off that wagon, that she might be exactly where she was supposed to be. She was wrong about one thing, though. The kitchen wasn't going to be easy. And neither was Silas Whitaker. Breakfast the next morning was the moment everything changed. Clara was up before first light. She had assessed her limitations clearly the night before and made decisions accordingly. The eggs were the problem. She had none. But she had the lard, the flour, the dried apples, the herbs, the last of the onions, the salt pork, and the coffee that Elliot had promised to handle. She made biscuits first tall, layered ones, worked quickly and baked hot, the kind her mother called honest biscuits because they required no embellishment to be good. She sliced the salt pork thin and rendered it slow in the skillet until it was crisp at the edges. She reconstituted the dried apples with a little water and a pinch of the dried herbs, a trick her mother's ate neighbor, an old Cherokee woman named Mrs. Birdcall, had taught her when she was 12, and let them cook down into something thick and sweet and vaguely spiced that bore almost no resemblance to the shriveled things she'd pulled from the crock. She made gravy from the drippings. She was plating the first biscuits when the hands started coming in. Pete Daly was first through the door, because Pete Daly always positioned himself first at anything he perceived as a competition. And in his mind, breakfast was an opportunity to maintain social status by being unimpressed. He walked in, with his hat still on, and his expression already arranged in the particular sneer of a young man committed to his own predetermined conclusion. He stopped. The sneer didn't exactly disappear, but it changed shape. He looked at the table, at the biscuits, at the small dish of cooked apples, at the gravy in the pan, at the sliced salt pork crisped and laid out on a cloth. "That can't be what's for breakfast," he said. "Sit down, Pete," Elliot said from behind him, already pulling out a chair. "I'm just down." Pete sat, the other hands filed in. 5 men total. McCready, who had been up early and was already on his 3rd cup of Elliot's coffee before anyone else arrived. 2 brothers named Holt and Carrie Fenn, who were mostly quiet and worked hard and asked very little of the world, beyond fair wages and a dry place to sleep. And the oldest hand on the ranch, a man named Gordon Hale, who had been riding for Silas Whitaker for 11 years, and who had opinions about everything and the confidence to express them without invitation. Gordon Hale was 60 years old, weathered down to something lean and angular, with eyes that had developed the particular sharpness of a man who had spent decades believing his first impressions were always correct. He looked at the table, he looked at Clara, he looked at the table again. He said nothing, he sat. The table was quiet as the food was passed. And then the eating started. Clara stood near the stove and watched, because she always watched at first meals. It was the only honest feedback. People could lie with their words and their faces, but they couldn't lie with the way they ate. Elliot took a biscuit, broke it open, and the steam rose in a clean white column. He looked at it the way a person looks at something that has interrupted their expectations. He put a piece in his mouth. "Lord," he said softly. Holt Fenn said nothing, but he reached for a second biscuit before he'd finished the first, which was its own kind of statement. Carrie Fenn added a spoonful of the apple mixture to his biscuit, took a bite, and made the involuntary sound of a man who has been cold for a very long time and has just stepped into warmth. McCready ate steadily and without comment, which, from McCready, Clara had already learned, was high praise. Pete Daly ate his biscuit in 3 quick bites, then sat still for a moment, then reached for another one without meeting anyone's eyes. Gordon Hale ate slowly. He took a biscuit. He added gravy. He ate it with the methodical patience of a man who was simultaneously assessing something and working very hard not to show that he was assessing it. He reached for a second serving of the apples. Nobody pointed this out. Silas came in last. He had the look of a man who had already been working for 2 hours and had not yet decided whether he deserved to stop. He sat at the head of the table, accepted the coffee Elliot poured without asking, and looked at the food in front of him. He ate. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye. He was 3 bites in when something shifted in his posture so subtle that she thought she might have imagined it a slight dropping of the shoulders, a slight slowing of the pace. Not quite relaxation, but an approximation of it, like a man who had been holding tension in his body for so long he had forgotten it was there, and something had just briefly reminded him what its absence felt like. He looked up. Across the table, Clara met his eyes. He didn't say anything. She didn't either, but something passed between them that was more honest than whatever careful distance they'd been maintaining since the wagon pulled up. Elliot broke the silence at the table. "Miss Clara," he said, "I got to ask. Where in Kansas did you learn to make biscuits that taste like?" He stopped, apparently unable to locate the right word. "Like what?" she said. "Like someone meant it," he said finally. Clara felt something warm move through her chest, not pride exactly, but something close to it. The particular satisfaction of being seen accurately. "My mother," she said. She had a saying. She said you could tell everything you needed to know about a person's character by how they fed other people. Whether they did it like it was a burden, or whether they did it like it was a gift. The table was quiet. Elliot nodded slowly, like he was filing that somewhere permanent. Pete Daly was conspicuously silent. Gordon Hale said, "Where's your mother now?" "She passed 6 years ago," Clara said. "What'd she die of?" "Gordon," that was McCready, flat and warning. "I'm asking a civil question," Gordon said. She died of pneumonia, Clara said, without any particular heat. In the spring. She always said if she had to go, she wanted it to be before summer, so she didn't miss the good growing season. A pause settled over the table. Sounds like a practical woman, Gordon said after a moment. The most practical woman I ever knew, Clara agreed. Gordon Hale looked at his plate. He ate the rest of his breakfast without another word. But he ate all of it. Clara took that as the first real victory. The days that followed moved fast, with the particular momentum of a place that has been stationary too long and has finally been given something to push against. Clara worked from first light to full dark, and she did it without complaint and without any apparent awareness that she was doing something extraordinary. She simply worked the way she had always worked, thoroughly, efficiently, with the deep attentiveness of someone who understood that details were not optional embellishments, but the entire structure everything else depended on. She organized the kitchen first, not by decoration or preference, but by function. Everything that got used daily went where a hand could reach it without thinking. Everything that was used occasionally went where it could be found without a search. Everything that was never used and couldn't explain itself got set aside and assessed. She found in the back of a deep cabinet a tin box she didn't initially recognize. Inside it were 2 recipe cards written in a careful, slightly slanted hand. One was for a rosemary bread, one was for something labeled E. W. Eleanor Whitaker. Clara held the cards for a long moment. Then she put them back in the tin and put the tin in a safe place, because she understood instinctively that these were not hers to use. Not yet, maybe not ever. Some things belonged to the grief of a place, and it wasn't her job to reach in and take them. By the end of the first week, she had established a food schedule not rigid, because the ranch's needs shifted with weather and work, but organized enough that the kitchen ran like a system instead of a crisis. She'd sent a written supply list into town with McCready, who had returned with everything on it, and also, without being asked, a small bag of dried chilies he said he'd spotted at the general store and thought she might want. She made chili 2 nights later. The table went so quiet when the first bowls were passed that Pete Daly looked up nervously, as though he suspected something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. Everything was exactly right. Clara was at the stove adding a second round of the spice mixture when she heard Pete say to Holt, low and reluctant and just audible enough, "I never had chili that tasted like this before." Holt said, "Me neither." Clara kept her back to them and said nothing. But she allowed herself a small private smile, because that was how it worked. Not with argument, not with confrontation, with evidence. One evening in the second week, Gordon Hale came into the kitchen while she was working and stood in the doorway with his arms folded across his chest and the particular bearing of a man who has decided to say something he's been building toward. Clara did not stop what she was doing. She had learned that when a man like Gordon Hale came to say something, the worst thing you could do was make a production of receiving it. So she kept working and let him arrive at it in his own time. "You manage this kitchen better than I expected," he said finally. "I manage it the way it needs to be managed," she said. "For a woman he paused, reconsidered. "For a woman who came here without knowing the place." Clara set down her spoon and turned to look at him. Not with anger, not with the particular wounded dignity that some women used as a defense, which she'd always thought was too expensive a strategy, because it required the other person to care about your dignity to work. She looked at him the way she looked at all things she needed to understand, directly and without drama. "Gordon," she said, "I've been big my whole life. I know that's what you keep stopping yourself from saying. And I know it's what the others say when they think I can't hear them. So let me save us both some time." He said nothing. "My size has never once prevented me from doing a single thing I decided to do," she said. "It has, however, told me a great deal about the character of other people. The ones who dismiss me because of it have never once been the ones I wanted to impress." Gordon Hale was quiet for a long moment. "My wife was a stout woman," he said. "She was the hardest worker I ever knew." "Was?" Clara said. "She passed 12 years ago." Clara looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged the way men do when they don't want you to see that they're not shrugging anything at all. She would have liked your chili, he said. He left. Clara turned back to the stove, and for a moment, in the warmth of the kitchen, she was slowly making into something real. She thought about her mother. About Eleanor Whitaker's recipe cards in their tin box. About Gordon's wife, who had been stout and hard-working and was now 12 years gone. About all the women who had stood in kitchens and fed people and been inadequately thanked for it. She added another pinch of the dried rosemary to the pot. For remembering. The arrangement between Clara and Silas remained careful and formal through those first weeks. They were polite to each other in the way that people are polite when they are acutely aware of the weight of their obligations and have not established any ground beyond them. He asked her once a week if she needed anything. She gave him an accurate list. He provided it. She thanked him. It was functional. It was nothing like a marriage. But there were moments, brief, unguarded, that suggested something more complex was occurring beneath the surface of their efficiency. One morning she was at the kitchen window when she saw him in the yard below, working with a horse that was refusing the saddle. He could have had a hand do it. He chose not to. She watched him work the animal, with a patience she hadn't expected from him, quiet, methodical, never forcing, just staying present until the horse came to its own decision. She thought, that's how he works with everything. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a comfort or a warning. Another time he came into the kitchen unexpectedly in the late afternoon and found her at the table with her mother's recipe notebook open in front of her and her reading glasses on and a pencil in her hand, making adjustments to a recipe in the margins. He stopped in the doorway. "I didn't know you wore glasses," he said. "I didn't know you came through the kitchen in the afternoon," she said. A pause. "I was looking for McCready," he said. "He's in the barn," she said. He mentioned something about a fence post. Silas nodded. He didn't move to go. His eyes moved briefly to the notebook on the table. "Is that your mother's?" he asked. "Yes. McCready said you made her rosemary broth on the first night. That you used Eleanor's herbs from the cellar." Clara looked up at him. He was looking at the notebook, not at her. "I didn't know they were hers when I found them," she said carefully. "I should have asked first." "No," he said. He was quiet for a moment. She would have wanted them used. She grew them to be used. Clara said nothing. She would have. He stopped. He cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said, "for the broth," and he left. Clara sat with her pencil in her hand and her mother's notebook open, and the afternoon light making long rectangles across the kitchen floor. And she thought about a man who had been running from grief for 7 years and didn't know how to stop because he'd made it so far already. She thought about what it cost to stay, and she thought, for the first time, with something that felt like real determination rather than just the hope she'd arrived with, that she wasn't going anywhere. The kitchen was not finished yet, neither was Clara Belrose. And the ranch that had laughed when her wagon pulled through the gate was just beginning to understand what it had let in. The morning after the chili dinner, Gordon Hale was the first man through the kitchen door. Not Pete, not Elliot Gordon. He came in quiet, hat in hand, and sat down at the far end of the table without a word. Clara was already at the stove. She didn't make anything of it. She just poured him coffee without being asked, and set it in front of him and went back to what she was doing. He wrapped both hands around the cup and said, "What's for breakfast?" "Cornmeal porridge with the last of the dried apples," she said. "And salt pork. McCready's bringing eggs from the Hendersons' place this morning, but they won't be here until midday." Gordon nodded. He drank his coffee. He said, "My wife used to make cornmeal porridge in winter. Said it stuck to a man's ribs better than anything." She was right, Clara said. Gordon was quiet again. "Then she used to add a little molasses, if we had it." Clara reached under the counter and produced a small, dark jar. Gordon stared at it. "McCready found it in the back of the storage room," she said. "Behind a broken crate. Still good." She set it on the table next to his coffee. Gordon Hale looked at that jar of molasses for a long moment, and something moved through his face that he didn't have a name for or didn't want to give one to. He picked it up, he turned it in his hands, he set it back down. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "Don't thank me," Clara said. "Thank MacCready. He's the one who dug it out." "I'll thank MacCready," Gordon said. "But that ain't why I'm thanking you." Clara kept her back to him and kept working. She understood exactly what he meant. The eggs arrived at noon, 3 dozen of them wrapped in straw in a wooden crate, delivered by MacCready along with 2 pounds of butter and a small wheel of hard cheese that he had apparently negotiated out of Mrs. Henderson, through a combination of persistence and the implied promise that Clara Belrose would repay the favor in kind at some future point. "She wants to know if you can teach her daughter to make biscuits," MacCready said, setting the crate on the counter. When Clara asked, she didn't say, "I think she wasn't expecting you to agree." "Tell her Saturday afternoon," Clara said, "if Silas doesn't need the kitchen." MacCready looked at her steadily. "You know he won't say no." "I know," Clara said, "but I'll ask him anyway." MacCready made the sound again that not quite law and went back out. Clara cracked the first egg into the bowl and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, something more solid than hope. The sense that she was building something that was going to last. Silas said yes when she asked about Saturday. He said it quickly, with no hesitation, and then stood there in the doorway of the kitchen, looking like a man who wanted to say something else and couldn't locate the right opening for it. Clara waited. She had learned that Silas Whitaker operated on his own internal schedule when it came to words, and that pushing him produced nothing useful, but patience sometimes produced things that surprised her. "The Henderson girl," he said finally. "How old is she?" "I don't know," MacCready didn't say. "Why, her father's been having a hard year," Silas said. "Fence broke in the spring, and the cattle got into the south field. Lost a third of the crop." Clara looked at him. "I was thinking," he said slowly, like a man testing ice, "that if you had extra after Saturday, it wouldn't be a bad thing to send something back with them. Something they could use for a few days." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll make a double batch of biscuits. And I'll put up a jar of the apple preserves I started yesterday." Silas nodded. "He started to turn away," she said. He stopped. "That was a kind thought," she said. He looked uncomfortable, the way men look when they've been caught being better than their reputation. "It's just practical," he said. "Good neighbors make a ranch easier to run." "Of course," she said, keeping her voice neutral. He left. She turned back to the eggs, and she allowed herself to think, quietly and without any fanfare, that the man she had agreed to marry for practical reasons might be more complicated than she'd initially calculated. And that complicated, in this case, might not be a warning. It might be an invitation. The first real crisis came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, and it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. She was in the kitchen making bread when she heard raised voices from the yard. Not the ordinary friction of tired men at the end of a long day, but the sharper, more dangerous sound of a genuine dispute. She wiped her hands and went to the window. Pete Daly and Elliot Crane were squared off near the water trough, Pete with his chest pushed forward and his jaw set in the particular configuration of a young man who has decided that winning an argument matters more than being right. Elliot was holding his ground, but barely. Clara couldn't hear the specific words. She didn't need to. She had seen this shape before, the younger, less confident person absorbing the pressures of someone who had decided that dominance was a substitute for merit. She went back to her bread. 10 minutes later, Elliot came into the kitchen. His left eye was slightly swollen. Clara set down the dough without comment and went to the cold water basin. She wrung out a cloth and handed it to him. "Sit," she said. He sat. He pressed the cloth to his eye and stared at the table. "What happened?" she asked, because she thought he probably needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to make it into a lesson about toughness. Pete said he stopped. He said things I shouldn't have let get to me. "What kind of things?" "About you," he said finally. Clara continued kneading the bread. "What kind of things about me?" she said, her voice entirely even. He said Silas must have been desperate to bring home someone who Elliot stopped again. "I told him to stop. He didn't stop, so I told him again, louder." And then he gestured vaguely at his eye. Clara was quiet for a moment. She shaped the bread loaf with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who has done this so many times the action has become a kind of thinking. "Elliot," she said. "Yes, ma'am, did you start that fight on my behalf?" Pause. "I reckon I did." Clara looked at him, she said, and looked up sharply. "I can fight my own battles," she said, not unkindly. "I've been doing it for 29 years. The difference is that I don't fight them with my fists. I fight them with time." "With time," he said. "Give me 3 more weeks," she said. "And watch what Pete Daly says about me then." Elliot looked at her for a long moment. "How are you so sure?" he asked. "Because I've done this before," she said. "Not here, but places like here," and the answer is always the same. You can't argue a person out of a prejudice, but you can feed it out of them. Slowly, one meal at a time, Elliot was quiet. He pressed the cloth to his eye. "That's either the smartest thing I ever heard," he said, "or it's a sign that you're the most patient person alive." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Clara said. He almost smiled, then winced because his eye protested it. "Go find McCready," she said. "He'll look at that. And Elliot, don't tell Silas how it happened." "He'll find out anyway, probably," she said, "but let him find out naturally. Not from us." Silas found out by dinner. He came into the kitchen with his face arranged in the particular stillness that she was learning meant he was controlling something. "Pete Daly, what about him?" Clarissa said. "McCready told me." "McCready talks too much," Clara said. "McCready talks exactly the right amount," Silas said. "Working," she said, "where he should be." "Clara, Silas." She turned from the stove and faced him. "I need you to hear me clearly. What Pete said and what Pete did, both of those things are Pete's problem to grow out of. Not yours to punish him for. If you fire him or dress him down publicly, it looks like you're defending something fragile. And I am not fragile." Silas's jaw was tight. "He hit Elliot," he said. "I know. In my yard." He stopped. "Over your wife," she said quietly. He was very still. "Yes," he said. "And I'm asking you, as your wife, to let me handle it the way I've chosen to handle it." A long pause stretched between them, taut and deliberate. "How?" he said. "With time," she said, "and with dinner. Which is going to be extraordinary tonight, and Pete Daly is going to eat every bite and hate himself for enjoying it. And that's going to do more to his conscience than any dressing down you give him." Silas looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite the expression he'd arrived with. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, surprised despite herself. "You've been right about everything else so far," he said. It was plainly stated, without embellishment, the way Silas stated most things. "I reckon I can trust your judgment on this." Clara turned back to the stove before he could see her face. Because her face, she was fairly certain, was doing something she wasn't ready for him to see yet. Dinner that night was roasted chicken, 2 birds that McCready had quietly acquired from the Henderson farm, along with the eggs, with the rosemary and onion, and a little of the hard cheese melted over the top, served with roasted root vegetables and fresh bread. The smell had been moving through the ranch house for 2 hours before the men came in, and by the time they sat down, even Pete Daly's studied indifference was showing cracks. He lasted 4 bites before he said quietly, to nobody in particular, "This is the best thing I've eaten since I left my mother's house." Nobody responded, but Elliot, across the table, looked up at Clara with an expression that said, "I see it." And Clara nodded back very slightly. 3 more weeks, she had said. She had overestimated. It took 10 days. On the 10th day, Pete Daly came into the kitchen in the early afternoon when everyone else was out. And he stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands, and the look of a young man who has been wrestling with something for a week and a half, and has finally lost. "Miss Clara," he said. She was at the table writing in her supply ledger. She looked up. "Pete." He was silent for a moment. "Working up to it. I said things," he said, "when you first got here. That weren't right. And I said things to Elliot that weren't right either. And I've been thinking about it a good deal, and He stopped. "I reckon I owe you an apology." Clara set down her pencil. She looked at him for a long moment. He was 19 years old. He had been raised with some values and some ignorance, the way most people were, and somewhere in the last 10 days the gap between those two things had become uncomfortable enough that he decided to do something about it. That was not nothing. "I accept your apology," she said. He exhaled. "I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure you'd offer one," she said. "So we're even." He turned to go, then stopped. "The chicken last night," he said, "with the cheese on top. I was wondering." He looked embarrassed. "My mother used to make something like that. I was wondering if you'd teach me how." Clara blinked. Then she said, "Come back Saturday. I'm already teaching the Henderson girl to make biscuits. I'll show you the chicken at the same time." His face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked remarkably like relief. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He left. Clara sat with her ledger and her pencil, and the afternoon quiet of the kitchen, and she thought one meal at a time. Then she thought, "My mother would have loved this." The third week brought the first real supply crisis of the winter season, and with it, the first genuine test of everything Clara had been building. A supply wagon from Cheyenne failed to arrive on its scheduled route, stopped by an early snowstorm that had come down from the north 3 days ahead of any reasonable prediction. The road was impassable. The stores in the nearest town, Millhaven, were already running low because 3 other ranches had cleaned out their own supplies before the storm hit. Silas came to the kitchen and told her plainly, what they had on the ranch was what they had. He couldn't say for how long. Clara asked him to sit down. He sat. She put coffee in front of him and then sat across from him and said, "Tell me exactly what we have." He told her. She listened without interrupting. She made a list in the margins of her supply ledger as he talked, not in the neat columns she normally used, but quickly in the shorthand of someone doing arithmetic in real time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "We have enough," she said. "Clara, not comfortably enough," she said, "but enough. If I reorganize how we're using what we have, and we stretch the protein with legumes, and I start using the smokehouse for the salt pork I've been saving, we can feed 6 people for 3 weeks on what's in this kitchen and that root cellar." Silas looked at her. "How?" he said. "Because I was raised by a woman who fed 4 children through a Kansas winter on 2 bushels of cornmeal, a side of bacon, and whatever she could grow in the cold frame," Clara said. "I know how to make things last. I know how to make people feel full when the portions are smaller. I know which combinations of food satisfy the body without requiring abundance." He was quiet. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Your trust," she said, "and for you to tell the men that meals are going to change for a few weeks and that they are going to eat what's put in front of them and be grateful for it." "They'll do that," he said. "Gordon might complain," she said. "Gordon always complains," Silas said. "It doesn't mean anything." Clara almost smiled. "I've noticed." He looked at her across the table, and again she felt that particular quality of his attention, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand, rather than simply evaluate. It was, she thought, the thing about him that had surprised her most. She had expected a practical man. She had found a thoughtful one. "You've been here less than a month," he said. 26 days, she said. "And you've already fed 6 men better than they've eaten in years, negotiated with 3 neighboring families, turned Gordon Hale from an adversary into something approaching an ally, and convinced Pete Daly to apologize for something I'm not certain he's ever apologized for in his life." Clara said nothing. "I just stopped. Started again. I want you to know that I see the work you're doing. The actual work of it." Another stop. "I know I'm not easy to live with." "You're not difficult," she said. "You're private. There's a difference." He looked at her. "Most people don't make that distinction," he said. "Most people aren't paying attention," she said. Something passed between them in the quiet of the kitchen, warm and careful and edged, with something that neither of them was prepared to name. Clara felt it in her chest, that particular awareness of a moment that matters more than it appears to from the outside. She looked down at her ledger. "I'll start the new meal plan tomorrow," she said. "All right," Silas said. He didn't move for a moment. Then he stood, pushed in his chair with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, and walked to the kitchen door. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. for more than the meals. He left. Clara sat with her ledger and her coffee, and the warmth of the kitchen she was slowly making into the center of something, and for the first time in 26 days, she let herself believe, not hope, believe that this was going to be all right. The storm lasted 11 days. In those 11 days, Clara did things in that kitchen that the ranch hands would still be talking about the following summer. She made bean and salt pork soup that was somehow richer and more satisfying than dishes made with twice the ingredients. She stretched the cornmeal into johnny cakes and porridge and a skillet bread that she cooked low and slow until the outside crisped and the inside stayed soft. And she served it with the last of the apple preserves measured out in careful portions that felt generous without being wasteful. She taught Elliot to make the johnny cakes so she could use the time for other preparations. She put Pete daily to work soaking the dried beans overnight and checking the smokehouse temperature. And he did it without complaint and with a focus that told her the apology had been genuine, that he was working out his contrition in the only currency he currently had. She sent McCready to the cellar twice a day to report on what remained and what the temperature was doing, because the cellar was the heart of the operation and she needed accurate information to plan. Gordon Hale, true to Silas's prediction, complained. He did it on the 4th day, when she served a dinner that was nourishing and well-seasoned but was indisputably smaller than what the men had come to expect. "A man can't work all day on that," he said, looking at his bowl. The table went quiet. Clara came from the stove and set a full ladle of extra broth into his bowl without a word. Gordon looked at it. "The broth has bone in it," she said. "It's filling if you drink it slow. The protein's there. It's just distributed differently." Gordon looked at the bowl. "Distributed differently," he repeated. "We have 11 more days," she said. "Possibly 12. I can feed us all through it. But I need everyone to trust me and eat what's put in front of them." She looked at each man at the table in turn. They all nodded. Even Gordon. He asked for a second ladle. She gave it to him. The 8th day of the storm brought the moment that changed everything between Clara and the men of Whitaker Ranch, and it came not from a meal or a conversation, but from a moment of genuine crisis that nobody had planned for. Holt Fenn came in from the barn at 2:30 in the afternoon, looking 10 years older than he had at breakfast, and the look on his face brought Clara up from the table before he said a word. "It's Carrie," he said. "He went down in the snow, maybe more." He got turned around between the barn and the fence line. Clara was already moving. She grabbed the largest pot and started water heating on the stove. She pulled the medicine box from the high shelf, not a large box, but a well-organized one she had reorganized in her first week, because she always reorganized medicine boxes in her first week anywhere. She found the strips of clean cloth she kept for bandages. She took the bottle of whiskey from the back of the storage room that she had located and never mentioned, and everyone had pretended not to know about. "Where is he?" she said. "Back room," Holt said. "McCready carried him." "Get Silas," she said. "Tell him we need the doctor from Millhaven when the road opens." "Go." Holt, Carrie Fenn, was sitting on the cot in the back room with his boot off and his face the color of old paste, and McCready was kneeling next to him looking helpless in the specific way that large, capable men look helpless when someone they care about is hurt. "Let me see," Clara said, kneeling down. Carrie Fenn was 23 years old and had never in his life let a woman he didn't know touch his foot, but he let Clara because she was already looking at it with the calm, focused attention of someone who was going to do what needed to be done, regardless of anyone's discomfort about it. "It's not broken," she said after a careful examination. "The ankle's badly sprained. Could have torn something in there, which is why you need the doctor when the road opens. For now we pack it cold to keep the swelling down, then wrap it for support, and you do not put weight on it." Carrie said through clenched teeth, "I got work too." "No," Clara said. "You ma'am the horses." "McCready and Pete can handle the horses," she said. "Your job for the next week is to stay off this foot. If you don't, you could do permanent damage. Do you understand me?" Carrie looked at her. He nodded. She packed the ankle. wrapped it with the efficient precision of someone who had done it before. Her younger brother had sprained both ankles at various points during a childhood characterized by poor judgment and enthusiasm. And then she sat back, looked at Carrie Fenn and said, "When did you last eat?" "Breakfast," he said. "That was 8 hours ago, Holt." She looked up. Holt was in the doorway. "Bring him a bowl of the soup. And the Johnny cake from this morning that's still on the counter. And coffee." "Yes, ma'am," Holt said, and disappeared immediately. Clara started to stand. Carrie caught her hand. He was embarrassed by it, she could see that, but he held on for just a moment. "Miss Clara," he said. "Thank you." She looked at him. He was young, and he was in pain, and he was a long way from home, and the gratitude in his face was not about the ankle. It was about the 8 hours since breakfast. It was about the fact that she had noticed. "You're all right," she said gently. "You're going to be fine." She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove, and let herself feel, for just a moment, the weight of all of it, the storm and the supplies, and the men who were depending on her and the ankle, and the 11 days still to go, and then she picked up the ladle and kept working. Because that was what you did. That was what her mother had taught her. You kept working, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Silas found her there an hour later, still at the stove, her back straight and her movements steady, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a long moment before he said anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was different from all the other times she'd heard it. "You knew what to do," he said. "You just knew." "My brother was clumsy," she said. "It was more than that," he said. She didn't answer. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, not at the head, where he always sat for meals, but at the side, the way someone sits when they want proximity rather than authority, and he said, "Sit down, Clara." She looked at him. "It'll hold for 5 minutes," he said. She sat. He was looking at his hands, clasped on the table in front of him, and she had the sense again of a man working up to something he'd been carrying for a while. "I owe you more than I've given you," he said. "You don't owe me." "Not in the way of transactions," he said. "I mean," he looked up. "I brought you here and I told you what you'd be managing, and I gave you the practical terms of the arrangement, and I didn't." He stopped. "I didn't think about what it cost you to come here. What you walked away from, what you walked into." Clara was very still. "I walked into a kitchen that needed work," she said quietly. "You walked into a house full of men who judged you before you unpacked your suitcase," he said. "You walked into a place where nobody was prepared to see you for who you actually are." And you just shook his head. You just got to work anyway. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. "Silas," she said, "I have spent my entire life walking into rooms that weren't ready for me. I've gotten good at it. You shouldn't have to be," he said. The simplicity of it stopped her. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the assessing look, not the controlled look, not the look that was managing its own complexity. Something more open than that. Something that cost him something. "No," she said after a moment. "I suppose I shouldn't." They sat together in the warmth of the kitchen, with the storm pressing at the windows and the soup holding steady on the stove, and Carrie Fenn's bandaged ankle resting in the back room, and 11 days still ahead of them, and neither of them said anything else. But something had shifted, something real and irreversible. And when Clara stood to go back to the stove, she carried it with her the knowledge that Silas Whitaker had looked at her and seen not a deficit to be accommodated, but a person to be reckoned with. That was, she thought, a beginning, a real one. The storm broke on the 12th day. McCready rode into Millhaven for the doctor and for supplies, and he came back with both, along with the information that 3 other ranches in the area had been in genuine hardship during the storm. Animals lost, men sick, food runs out entirely. Whitaker Ranch had lost nothing, not one man, not one animal. The men were fed and warm, and Carrie Fenn had a properly examined ankle and a doctor's confirmation that Clara's field treatment had prevented further damage. Silas said nothing about it publicly, but that evening, after dinner, when the hands had gone and the kitchen was quiet, he came in and found Clara washing the last of the pots. He picked up the drying cloth without being asked. She handed him the pot without comment. They stood side by side at the basin in the warm kitchen light, and they worked in a silence that was not empty but full of 11 days, and a storm, and a sprained ankle, and a bowl of broth, and a moment at the table where something had shifted. It was the most natural thing that had happened between them since she arrived. And Clara understood as she handed him the last pot, and he dried it with the same deliberate care he brought to every task, that this was what a life could look like if both people were willing to do the work. Not romance, not yet, but something more durable than romance. Something that could hold weight. The doctor from Millhaven was a compact, precise man named Dr. Aldous Reeve, who had been practicing medicine in Wyoming Territory for 19 years, and who had, in that time, developed the particular talent of saying difficult things without softening them into uselessness. He examined Carrie Fenn's ankle thoroughly, confirmed Clara's field assessment with a brief nod that managed to convey both approval and the professional restraint of a man who didn't hand out compliments easily. And then he came into the kitchen and sat down at the table because Clara had coffee ready, and he had ridden 12 miles through post-storm mud, and he was not a man who refused good coffee. "You packed it correctly," he said. "The cold compress in the first hour. That's what kept the swelling manageable." "My brother," Clara said. "He was enthusiastic about climbing things he shouldn't." "Smart woman," Reeve said. He drank his coffee. He looked around the kitchen with the eyes of someone who had been in a great many kitchens and was making an involuntary comparison. "This place smells different than it did the last time I was out here." "When were you last here?" Clara asked. 2 winters ago." "Silas had a hand with a bad fever." He paused. "Place smelled like burned beans and unwashed wool." "That sounds accurate," Clara said. Reeve looked at her directly. "You're the new wife." "I am." He studied her for a moment with the frank, assessing gaze of a medical man who had long ago stopped pretending that observation was impolite. "You did good work on that ankle," he said. "You do good work in here too, from what I can see." This ranch needed both. He finished his coffee, stood, and put his hat back on. "Tell Silas I'll be back in 2 weeks to check the ankle," he said. "And tell him," he paused at the door, "tell him he made a better decision than he probably knows." He left before Clara could respond. She stood in the kitchen with his empty cup, and the warmth of a compliment from a man who didn't give them lightly, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been restless since the day she stepped off that wagon. She was still feeling it when Silas came in 10 minutes later, and she passed along the doctor's message. He was quiet for a moment. "What did he mean?" Silas said. "Better decision than he knows." Clara looked at him steadily. "I suspect he meant the marriage." Silas held her gaze. "He's not wrong," he said. He said it simply, plainly, with no embellishment, in the way Silas said the things that mattered most. And then he picked up his hat from the hook and went back out before either of them had to decide what to do with it. Clara turned back to the stove. She was smiling, and she didn't try to stop it. The week after the storm was a week of recovery and rebuilding, and in that week something changed in the atmosphere of Whitaker Ranch that was difficult to name precisely but impossible to miss. The men moved differently through the space. Not slower, if anything. They moved with more purpose, but with a quality of awareness that hadn't been there before. They held doors. They returned tools to the kitchen without being asked. Pete Daly started sweeping the porch steps in the morning before breakfast, which nobody had requested, and which he did with the particular quiet industry of a young man working off a debt he couldn't repay any other way. Gordon Hale began appearing in the kitchen doorway in the evenings, not to eat, but just to talk. It started casually. He'd comment on the weather, on the state of the fences, on a piece of ranch gossip from Millhaven that McCready had brought back along with the doctor. But gradually, over the course of a week, the conversations deepened into something else. He told her about his wife Martha, about how she had come to Wyoming from Ohio and hated every inch of it for the first 3 years, and then one morning woke up and couldn't imagine living anywhere else. About how she could identify any bird by its sound alone, and how she'd taught Gordon to do the same, and how he still did it, out of habit, every morning, and how it was both a comfort and an ache. Clara listened the way her mother had taught her to listen, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually receiving what was being said. One evening, Gordon said, "You remind me of her sometimes." Clara looked at him. "Martha was big-boned too," he said. "Strong. She didn't take nonsense from anyone, but she never wasted energy being angry about it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you were the hardest on me when I first arrived?" she said. Not accusatory, just curious. Gordon was quiet for a longer moment. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe when you lose someone like that, you spend a while being angry at anyone who makes you remember them." Clara nodded. She understood that completely. "Gordon," she said. "I'm glad you remembered her." He looked at his hands. "Yeah," he said roughly. "Me too." The first visitors came on a Thursday, 11 days after the storm broke, and their arrival announced itself with the sound of a wagon and 2 horses coming up the ranch road at a clip that suggested purpose rather than casual calling. Clara was in the kitchen. She heard the wagon. She went to the window. 2 men she didn't recognize, well-dressed for the territory, not ranch-dressed, but town-dressed, with the specific quality of clothing that announced money, without requiring anyone to ask. The wagon behind them carried what appeared to be surveying equipment. Her stomach tightened. She had seen men like this before. Not here. In Kansas, when she was 14, and a pair of men in good coats had come to the neighboring farm with surveying equipment and polite voices, and left 3 months later with the deed. She dried her hands. She went to find Silas. He was already in the yard. The taller of the 2 men was talking hat in hand, with the smooth manner of someone who had rehearsed affability until it had become its own kind of weapon. His name, Clara would learn, was Harlan Breckett. He was a land agent from Cheyenne, representing a development consortium that was, as he described it, working to bring modern progress to the Wyoming Territory. The shorter man was introduced as his associate and said almost nothing, which Clara noted. In her experience, the quiet one was almost always the more dangerous one. "We're not interested in selling," Silas said. "Of course not," Breckett said pleasantly. "And we're not here to pressure you into anything, Mr. Whitaker. We're simply conducting surveys of the region to understand the landscape of opportunity. We thought it only proper to introduce ourselves to the landholders in the area." "You thought right," Silas said. "You've introduced yourself. I'll pass along your card if any of my neighbors are interested." Breckett smiled. "We'd be happy to speak with your neighbors directly. Perhaps you could arrange an introduction? We find that a familiar face helps put people at ease." "My neighbors can decide for themselves who puts them at ease," Silas said. Breckett's smile didn't waver. "Naturally," he said. "Naturally. Well, we won't take up any more of your time today, Mr. Whitaker. We may be in the area for some weeks. The territory is substantial." He glanced toward the ranch house. His eyes moved briefly, registering Clara in the doorway. He tipped his hat. She didn't move. The wagon left. Silas came back to where Clara was standing and stood beside her, watching it go. "They've been through 3 other ranches already this week," he said. "McCready heard it in Millhaven. What do they actually want?" Clara said. "Water rights," Silas said. "There's a creek that runs through 5 properties in this valley, including mine. If someone builds a mill or a processing facility near the headwaters, they can control the flow downstream. Anyone who depends on that water would have to negotiate with whoever owns the controlling position." Clara looked at him. "And who owns the controlling position currently?" "Henderson has the headwaters on his land," Silas said. "But Henderson is having a bad year." She remembered. Fence broke in spring, lost a third of the crop. The biscuits she'd sent, the apple preserves. How bad a year, she said. Silas's jaw tightened slightly, bad enough that a man with a good coat and a smooth voice might find a sympathetic hearing. Clara was quiet for a moment. "We should have the Hendersons for dinner," she said. Silas looked at her. "Not just the Hendersons," she said. "All of them. Every family in this valley, here at this table." "Clara, Silas." She turned to face him fully. "Those men are going to work on each family separately. Divide them. That's how it's done. You make each person feel like they're the only one being offered something, and you make them afraid to tell their neighbors because they don't want to lose the advantage." She'd seen it. She knew it in her bones. The only defense against that is to put everyone in the same room, where they can see each other, where they can talk honestly, where they know they're not alone. He looked at her for a long moment. That's 6 families, he said, maybe 30 people. I know, she said, in the middle of a supply shortage. I know, she said again. Clara, we barely came through the storm. We came through it fine, she said, because I knew what I was doing. And I know what I'm doing now. Let me plan it. Give me 1 week to prepare, and I will feed 30 people a meal that will bring this valley together. And when Harlan Breckett comes back with his good coat and his surveying equipment and his quiet associate, he is going to find 6 families who have sat at the same table and know each other's faces and are not going to be divided. The yard was very quiet. McCready, who had appeared from the direction of the barn, was standing very still at a respectful distance in the way of a man who understood that he was witnessing something important and had the decency to be unobtrusive about it. Silas looked at Clara. She looked back. All right, he said. Then he almost said something else, and didn't, and turned to McCready. Ride to the Henderson place, he said. Tell them Whitaker Ranch is hosting a valley dinner. Saturday week. Ask them to pass the word. McCready's face broke into something that wasn't quite a smile but was warmer than his usual expression. Yes, sir, he said. He was already moving toward the horses before Silas finished speaking. Clara had 1 week. She had never in her life worked harder. The preparation was a campaign conducted with the precision and intensity of something that mattered because it did matter, in ways that went far beyond the meal itself. She wrote lists. She reorganized every supply the ranch had in order of utility and longevity. She sent Elliot and Pete to 2 different neighboring towns for supplies that Millhaven couldn't provide, with specific written lists and the instruction that they were not to return without everything on them. She enlisted the entire ranch in the preparation. Gordon Hale, who turned out to have spent 3 years working in a smokehouse before he came to Wyoming, was put in charge of the smoked meats and given authority over the smokehouse operation that he executed with the focused pride of a man whose expertise had been recognized. Elliot made bread he had been practicing for 3 weeks, and his biscuits were now genuinely good, which he was unreasonably proud of and which Clara encouraged, because confidence in the kitchen was a skill that compounded. Pete Daly, who had been asking questions with increasing seriousness during his Saturday lessons, was given the roasted vegetables and told they were his responsibility, which he received with a gravity that suggested he understood the assignment was also a statement of trust. McCready coordinated logistics with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades solving practical problems and was quietly delighted to have a problem worth solving. Carrie Fenn, ankle still wrapped and under strict instructions to stay off it, was given the task of hand-lettering the seating arrangement cards, a task he approached with painstaking care, his tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration, because he was a man who took seriously whatever he was capable of doing. Holt Fenn said nothing and did everything that needed to be done before it was asked. And Silas rode to every family in the valley himself, not just to deliver the invitation, to sit with each man and drink coffee and talk about the water rights and Harlan Breckett and what it might mean if one family sold without talking to the others. He didn't tell anyone what to do. He just made sure everyone had the same information. Clara knew what that cost him. He was not a man who asked things of people easily. He told her about it each evening, coming into the kitchen at the end of the day, with the specific tiredness of someone who had been managing other people's fears as well as their own. She fed him. Not just food, though. The food was good, always, but the particular kind of attention that made a person feel that their tiredness had been witnessed and was worth acknowledging. She asked the right questions. She listened to the answers. She said, when he'd finished talking about a particularly difficult conversation with a man named Arvis Cole, whose wife was sick, and whose anxiety about the water rights was making him susceptible to whatever Breckett was offering, "What did you tell him?" "I told him," Silas said, "that he wasn't the only one scared. That every man in this valley was scared, and that the difference between being scared alone and being scared together is whether you make decisions that can be undone. Clara looked at him. That was exactly right, she said. He looked tired and certain and uncertain all at once. I hope so, he said. It was, she said. Arvis Cole is going to come on Saturday. He did. They all came. Saturday arrived cold and clear, with the particular brightness of a Wyoming winter day that seems to have more sky in it than other days. And by mid-morning the Whitaker ranch yard was full of wagons and horses, and people who hadn't all been in the same place at the same time, since the church social the previous August. The Henderson family arrived first. Frank Henderson was a tall, tired man who shook Silas's hand with both of his, which said more than words about his state of mind. His wife, Anne, came directly to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at what Clara was doing and said, "Tell me what I can do." Clara put her to work immediately, because she could see that Anne Henderson was a woman who handled worry by doing things, and there were plenty of things to be done. The Farthings came next, with their 5 children, the youngest of whom was immediately adopted by Elliot as his personal responsibility, and kept firmly away from the stove. The Coles arrived Arvis and his wife Margaret, who was thin and pale but upright, with the particular dignity of a woman who is managing something difficult and has decided that dignity is non-negotiable, and Margaret Cole came into the kitchen and looked at Clara and said, "You're the one who sent the apple preserves to the Hendersons during the storm." "McCready arranged it," Clara said. "McCready didn't make them," Margaret said. She sat down at the kitchen table without being invited and said, "My husband is scared." "I know," Clara said. "Those men in the good coats offered him money," Margaret said. "Not enough, but more than he's holding right now, and when a person's scared, they reach for what's in front of them," Clara said. Margaret looked at her steadily. "What's going to happen today?" she said. "People are going to eat together," Clara said, "and talk to each other. And remember that they're not alone." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "And you think that's enough?" Clara turned from the stove and looked at her directly. "I think that's everything," she said. By 1 o'clock, 32 people were arranged around a configuration of tables that Silas and McCready had assembled in the main room of the ranch house, extending into the hallway and the sitting room that nobody had sat in since before Clara arrived. The tables were covered with whatever cloths Clara had been able to assemble, some proper, some improvised, and set with whatever dishes the ranch could provide, and what several of the visiting families had quietly brought from their own houses, because word had gotten around that this was a real dinner, and people had responded accordingly. The food came out in waves. Gordon's smoked meat, first brisket and pork ribs that had been working in the smokehouse for 3 days, served with the pan drippings reduced into something that people were putting on everything. Then the bread, Elliot's biscuits, and a loaf bread Clara had made, and a dense, sweet cornbread that Pete Daly had somehow produced, following Clara's written instructions with an intensity that had resulted, against all reasonable expectation, in something genuinely excellent. Then the roasted vegetables, the bean stew, the apple and dried fruit compote, the hard cheese from the Hendersons' farm, sliced and arranged. Then, last, Clara's centerpiece, the slow-cooked beef stew that had been on the stove since before dawn, built from the ranch's best remaining stock, flavored with the last of Eleanor Whitaker's dried rosemary and thyme, thickened with winter wheat, and seasoned with a patience and care that was apparent in every spoonful. The room went quiet when the stew was served, not the polite quiet of people being careful. The deep quiet of people who have been given something they didn't know they needed. Young Elliot said softly, to nobody in particular, "I forgot food could feel like coming home." It was the same thing he'd said in the kitchen weeks ago. But this time, 32 people heard it, and it was true for all of them. Anne Henderson pressed her hand to her mouth briefly. Margaret Cole looked at her husband across the table, and Arvis Cole looked back, and something passed between them that was not quite a decision, but was the ground a decision could grow from. The children ate with the single-minded focus of children, encountering something remarkable. Gordon Hale sat at the far end of the table next to Frank Henderson, and Clara watched them from the kitchen doorway as Gordon talked, low and steady, and Frank listened, and then Frank talked, and Gordon listened. And somewhere in the middle of the stew course, they arrived at the kind of conversation that men don't have until they've been given a reason to trust the space they're in. After the meal, when the plates had been cleared and the coffee was going around, and the children had been released into the yard under Elliot's supervision, Silas stood at the head of the table. He was not a man who made speeches. Everyone in the room knew that, and the ones who didn't could tell it from the way he stood, like a man doing something necessary rather than something he enjoyed. "I want to say something about this valley," he said. The room went quiet. "I've been on this land for 15 years. My father was on it before me. Most of you, same story. And in 15 years, I've watched this valley come through hard winters and drought and bad markets and the particular kind of bad luck that the territory seems to specialize in." He paused. "We came through all of it because we had neighbors who understood that the land doesn't care whether you're proud." A few nods around the table. "There are people right now who want to change that," he said. "Who are betting that if they approach each of us separately, they can offer enough to make isolation look like wisdom. I want you to know before anyone makes any decision about anything what was on this table tonight. That wasn't magic. That was what this valley produces when it works together. That's what we've always had and what someone is trying to buy out from under us." He looked around the table. "I'm not telling anyone what to do," he said. "That's not my place. I'm just asking everyone to talk to each other before they talk to anyone else." The room was quiet. Then Frank Henderson said, "You have my word on that, Silas." And Arvis Cole, across the table, said, "Mine too." One by one, the men of the valley spoke, and the room that had been full of good food and careful strangers slowly became something else. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it happen, and she felt the particular quality of satisfaction that comes not from doing something yourself, but from creating the conditions that allow others to do it. This was what her mother had meant. This was what a kitchen was for. Silas caught her eye from across the room. He didn't smile. He wasn't the kind of man whose face moved easily toward smiling in public. But something in his expression conveyed something that required no translation. She nodded once. He nodded back. Harlan Breckett returned to Whitaker Ranch 2 days later. He came alone this time, without the quiet associate, and without the surveying equipment. He came in the mid-afternoon when the yard was quiet, and Clara was in the kitchen, and Silas was at the desk in the small room he used as an office, going through the ranch accounts. Clara heard the horse. She went to the window. She went to the office door. "Breckett," she said quietly. Silas looked up. He set down his... He came out to the yard, and Clara came with him, because she had decided without asking anyone's permission, and without making an announcement, that this conversation was not one she intended to observe from a window. Breckett looked at her when she appeared beside Silas. Something moved in his face. "A recalibration, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, smoothly, tipping his hat. "Mr. Breckett," she said. He turned his attention to Silas. "I heard you hosted quite a dinner the other night," he said. The pleasantness was intact, but had developed a texture, a slight tightness at the edges that hadn't been there before. "We did," Silas said. "Most of it." Breckett smiled. "Community spirit, admirable. I hope no one got the impression that our consortium represents any kind of threat to that." "We're simply Breckett," Silas said. Breckett stopped. "I think you should know," Silas said, "that the families in this valley have agreed to consult with each other before making any individual decisions regarding their land or their water rights. Collectively." Breckett absorbed this. "That's their right, of course," he said. "It is, and their intention." Breckett's eyes moved to Clara. She looked back at him with the same expression she had used on Gordon Hale in the first week direct, without drama, carrying the particular calm of a woman who knows exactly where she stands. "You know," Breckett said, after a moment, looking at her, "I heard about the dinner. Word travels fast in a territory this size, I heard." He paused. "I heard the food was extraordinary." "It was," Clara said. "You're doing, I'm told. The ranch is doing," she said. "I just organized it." Breckett looked at her for a long moment. He was a smart man, she could see that. smart enough to understand that the conversation he had come to have was no longer available to him, and that the person most responsible for that was the woman standing beside Silas Whitaker in a kitchen apron and plain boots, looking at him like she'd seen his type before, and had already decided what to think of it. "Well," he said, "I won't take up any more of your time." He tipped his hat. He left. Neither Clara nor Silas spoke until the sound of the horse had faded down the ranch road. Then McCready appeared from the direction of the barn, watching the retreating dust. "Gone," he said. "For now," Silas said. McCready made the sound. "The not quite law." "You think he'll be back?" Clara said. "Men like that always come back," Silas said. "But they come back looking for weak points. And the weak points aren't there anymore." She looked at him. "Because of Saturday," she said. "Because of you," he said. McCready went back to the barn. Clara and Silas stood in the yard in the cold winter air, and the ranch spread out around them, the kitchen with its warm stove, the barn where Carrie Fenn's ankle was healing, and the horses were fed, and the smokehouse still carried the faint smell of 3 days' good work, and Silas looked at all of it, and then looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "When you came here," he said, "you had a plan. You knew what you were doing. The kitchen, the storm, the dinner that wasn't luck." "No," she said. He paused, reconsidering. "Did you come here knowing you'd need to do all of this? Or did you just know how to do it when it was needed?" She said, "Yes." Clara considered the question honestly. "My mother used to say that capable women don't plan ahead because they think they're special," she said. "They plan ahead because they know the world doesn't make room for them, and they'd better make their own." Silas was quiet. "She sounds like she was remarkable," he said. "She was the strongest person I've ever known," Clara said. He was looking at her again with that open, effortful look that cost him something. "Clara," he said. "Yes, I am glad you came here," he said. The words were simple. They were also the most important thing anyone had said to her since her mother died. She felt them in her chest like a match striking. "I am too," she said. She meant it more than she had ever meant it anything. They went inside. The kitchen was warm and the coffee was still hot and the ranch was quiet around them. And Clara thought about Harlan Breckett riding back toward Cheyenne and 6 families who had eaten at the same table, and Frank Henderson, who had shaken Silas' hand, with both of his and Arvis Cole, who had looked at his wife across the room and found the beginning of a decision. She thought about Eleanor Whitaker's rosemary in the stew. "For remembering," she thought. "I am going to remember this for the rest of my life." She poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of Silas and sat across from him, and he looked at the cup and then at her, and he said, "What are you thinking about?" "Your first wife's rosemary," she said honestly. He was quiet. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes, I should have told you more about her when you arrived," he said. "You didn't have to," Clara said, "but I'd like to hear. If you want to tell me." He looked at his coffee. And then, for the first time since she'd arrived at Whitaker Ranch, Silas Whitaker began to talk about his grief, not around it, not past it, but directly into it, and Clara sat across the table and listened the way her mother had taught her. And the kitchen held them both, warm and steady and real. The way a good kitchen always did. Silas talked for a long time that night. Clara refilled his coffee twice without interrupting, and she listened the way she always listened, not waiting for a pause so she could respond, but actually receiving every word, letting it settle before the next one arrived. He told her about Eleanor, about how they had met in Ohio when Silas was 22 and working his uncle's farm, and how Eleanor had come to a church social wearing a blue dress and an expression of amused skepticism toward everything around her, and how he had been so completely unprepared for her that he'd said something entirely foolish, and she had laughed at him, and he had decided on the spot that he would marry her. He told her it had taken 2 years to convince Eleanor of the same idea. "She was smarter than me," he said. "She always was. She knew what Wyoming would cost her, and she came anyway. She never once complained about it." "Did she love it?" Clara asked. "The way Mrs. Henderson's wife grew to love it? She loved this land the way you love something that has tested you," he said. "Not easily, not without cost, but completely." He was quiet for a moment. She died in April, he said. 7 years ago. Fever that came on fast and didn't leave. The doctor came, but he stopped. There wasn't anything to be done. Clara said nothing. The hardest part, he said, wasn't the first month. The first month you're just surviving. The hardest part was the first spring after. When the rosemary came back up along the south fence. She'd planted it the year before, and I hadn't thought about it all winter, and then one morning it was just there. Growing, like it didn't know she was gone. Clara felt something move through her chest. And you left it, she said. I couldn't touch it, he said. I couldn't pull it out and I couldn't tend it, so I just left it. And it kept growing, and every year it came back and I kept leaving it alone because doing anything else felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make. Clara looked at her coffee cup, and then I used it, she said quietly. The night I arrived. Yes, I'm sorry, she said. I truly didn't know. I know you didn't, he said. And when McCready told me when I smelled it in the kitchen that first night, he stopped again. Then it didn't feel like a violation. That's what I'm trying to say. It felt like he searched for it, like something that had been holding its breath for 7 years finally let it out. The kitchen was completely quiet. She would have liked you, he said. Clara looked up. He was looking at her with the open expression, the one that cost him. She was practical, he said, but not cold. She believed that a kitchen's. He paused. Where you remind people they matter, Clara said softly. He stared at her. That's what my mother always said, she said. That's exactly what Eleanor used to say, he said. They sat with that for a moment. The particular weight of a coincidence that doesn't feel like a coincidence. Silas, Clara said, I'm not Eleanor, I know that. I want to be sure you know it, she said. Because I think sometimes when a person loses someone, they look for them in other people. And I don't want, she chose her words carefully, I don't want you to see me clearly just to find out later that part of what you were seeing was someone else. He looked at her for a long time. Clara, he said. The things I admire about you are not the things that reminded me of Eleanor. They are entirely your own. She held his gaze. All right, she said. All right, he said. They finished their coffee in a quiet that had become somewhere between the Rosemary and the Valley dinner, and 32 people eating at the same table, something different from the careful formality they'd started with. It wasn't easy what they were building, but it was real. And Clara had always preferred real. Breckett didn't come back that week. But his quiet associate did, not to the ranch, to Millhaven. McCready heard about it from the woman who ran the dry goods store, who had eyes like a hawk and the particular gift of absolute recall for other people's conversations. The associate whose name McCready reported was a Mr. Doyle Fitch had been in the store 3 days running, talking to everyone who came through, asking careful questions about the families in the valley. Not about their land, about their debts. McCready came into the kitchen and told Clara this in a low, measured voice while Silas was still in the yard, and the way he told her directly, without embellishment. Watching her face for her reaction told her that he understood she was the right person to receive this information first. He's looking for weak points, Clara said. That's what I reckon, McCready said. The coals, she said. Margaret told me Arvis had an offer. And they're carrying debt from last year's poor harvest. McCoo holds the debt. Bank in Cheyenne, he said. Same city Brackett's consortium operates out of. Clara was still for a moment. Go get Silas, she said. Silas came in from the yard and sat down and listened with the controlled stillness of a man who is managing something large inside a small container. When McCready finished, Silas said, they're going to squeeze Arvis from both sides. The bank calls the debt early, and Fitch appears with an offer the same week. Yes, Clara said. Can they do that? Call the debt early? If there's a clause in the loan terms that allows it, she said. And there usually is if the bank wants it badly enough. Silas looked at her. How do you know about loan terms? My father's farm, she said simply. Kansas. I was 16. Same kind of men with the same kind of coats. He absorbed that. What happened to the farm, he said. We lost it, she said. The word landed in the kitchen like a stone. Not because my father was foolish, she added. Because he didn't know what they were doing until they'd already done it. Because he faced it alone. She looked at Silas steadily. Arvis Cole is not going to face it alone. Silas was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? He said. I want to go see Margaret Cole, she said. Today, and I want you to ride to Frank Henderson. And I want both conversations to happen before Fitch makes his next move. Clara, I know it's not our business in the ordinary sense, she said. But those men made it the Valley's business the moment they started working the Valley together. And we invited those families to our table. That means something. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and got his hat. I'll be at the Henderson place by mid-afternoon, he said. Back by dark, he was out the door before she finished pulling on her coat. McCready drove her to the Cole place in the wagon. Margaret Cole met her at the door with an expression that was three things at once: relieved, frightened, and fiercely trying to be neither. I was wondering when someone would come, Margaret said. I should have come sooner, Clara said. They sat at Margaret's kitchen table, which was smaller than Clara's, and had a crack along one edge that had been carefully mended with something dark. The kitchen was clean and spare, and told the story of a woman who made order out of limited means, with the kind of pride that doesn't announce itself. Clara laid it out plainly, what she knew about Fitch, what she suspected about the bank, what the timing likely meant. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Margaret said, Arvis already had a letter from the bank. Came 4 days ago. They want the quarterly payment early. By the end of the month. Do you have it? Margaret said. Not without selling something we can't afford to sell. How much? Clara said. Margaret told her. Clara did the arithmetic in her head. That's manageable, she said. Between the Valley families, collectively that's manageable. Margaret stared at her. You can't ask people to... I'm not asking, Clara said. I'm telling you what's possible. The decision is yours and Arvis's. But I want you to know that if you decide you want to fight this, you will not be fighting it alone. Margaret's composure, which had been extraordinary for the duration of the conversation, made a single visible crack. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went bright, she said. It wasn't an ungrateful question, it was a genuine one. Why would you've been in this valley 3 months? My family lost a farm when I was 16, Clara said. Because nobody came. Margaret looked at her. I've been waiting 20 years to be in a position to go, Clara said quietly. The ride back to Whitaker Ranch was quiet, except for the sound of the wagon and McCready's steady handling of the horses. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about her father's face the day the bankmen came, and the particular way a man looks when he understands that the thing he built is going to be taken, and there is nothing left to do about it. She thought not this time. Silas was back before dark, as he'd promised. He came into the kitchen and sat down and said, Henderson already knew about the letter to Cole. He heard it from his wife, who heard it from predicted at the goods store before Fitch even got there. Good, Clara said. Frank wants to help. He's got cash saved from the cattle sale last fall. He was going to put it toward the fence repair, but he says that can wait. Who else? Clara said. Farthing can contribute something small. Silas said. I said. He paused. He cleared his throat. I said Whitaker Ranch would cover the remainder, if it came to that. Clara looked up from the stove. Silas, it's the right thing, he said. I know it is, she said. I just stopped. Thank you. He shook his head like thanks was beside the point. There's one more thing, he said. His voice shifted. Became more careful. She turned fully to face him. Frank Henderson told me something about Brackett's consortium, he said. Something he heard through a contact in Cheyenne. The consortium isn't just buying water rights. They're working with the Territorial Land Office. There's a clerk there who's been falsifying property boundary records, making the official maps show acreage as smaller than it actually is, so that when the consortium buys, they get more than what's documented. The kitchen was very quiet. How many properties? Clara said. Frank doesn't know. His contact didn't have the details. But he said. Silas paused. He said Whitaker Ranch was on the list. Clara felt the cold of it move through her, not fear exactly. Anger. The clean, specific anger of a person who has seen this done before and watched it succeed and has carried the weight of that outcome for 20 years. "Do you have your original deed?" she said. "Yes, in the strong box." "Survey records? From when your father established the original boundaries?" "Yes, and your father's, if he kept them?" "He did." "I have everything. Get them. Tonight. And tomorrow morning, I want to look at every one of them." He stared at her. "Clara, I grew up on a farm that a land agent decided to steal through paperwork," she said. "My father didn't know to check the records until it was too late. I read every document in that house by lamplight for 3 nights, trying to find something we could use, and I was 16 years old, and I knew more about what had happened than he did." Her voice was steady. Not loud, but carrying the weight of 20 years of accumulated clarity. "I know what to look for, let me look." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and went to the strong box. He came back with a leather satchel that was thick with documents, some yellowed with age, some newer, all carefully organized in the way of a man who respected the importance of records, even when the world was not requiring him to think about them. He put them on the table. Clara opened the satchel. She read until midnight. Silas sat across from her for the first 2 hours, then moved to the chair by the stove when his eyes got heavy. And somewhere around 10 o'clock he was asleep in it, with his arms folded and his chin dropped, and the expression of a man who has finally trusted someone enough to stop watching. Clara kept reading. She found it at 11:30. A discrepancy between the original survey from 1861, conducted by a federal surveyor named Hargrove, whose handwriting was precise and whose measurements were meticulous, and a subsequent county record from 1869 that showed the eastern boundary of Whitaker land as 14 feet shorter than Hargrove's original documentation. 14 feet. It didn't sound like much, but the eastern boundary ran along the creek. 14 feet along a creek, over the length of the property, meant the difference between owning the water access and not owning it. And if the consortium was working from the 1869 county record. She sat back, she thought very carefully, then she woke Silas. He came awake quickly, the way men do who have trained themselves to, and looked at her with immediate alertness. "I found something," she said. She showed him. He looked at the 2 documents, side by side, and she watched his face as he understood what he was seeing. And what he was seeing was that someone had been planning this for longer than any of them had known. "The 1869 record," he said. "My father never questioned it." "Why would he?" Clara said. "It was an official county document." "But if Hargrove's original federal survey says differently?" "The federal survey supersedes the county record," Clara said. "If we can establish that the 1869 document contains a deliberate error, and if we can connect that error to the land office, Clerk Frank's contact mentioned then every transaction Brackett's consortium has made, based on that county record, is legally contestable." Silas looked at her. "Clara," he said, "how do you know that?" "I told you," she said. "I read everything I could find when I was 16. And then I read more, and then I spent 20 years making sure I would never again be in a room where someone was doing something to me through paperwork, and I couldn't understand it." He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the assessing look, not the open, costly look. Something more fundamental than both. "We need a lawyer," she said. "A good one. From outside Cheyenne, because Cheyenne is where the consortium operates, and we can't know who they have there." "Denver, maybe. I know a man in Denver," Silas said. "Practiced territorial law for 20 years, honest." "Can you reach him?" "I'll send a wire from Millhaven tomorrow morning." "And the other families," Clara said. "If there's a falsified boundary for Whitaker Ranch, there may be others. They need to pull their original survey documents too." Silas nodded. He looked at the documents on the table. Then he looked at her. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right. When you came here," he said, "when you agreed to this arrangement, did you have any idea?" She said. "I came here because I needed a new beginning and you needed a household managed." That was all. And now, he said. The kitchen was warm and quiet, and the documents were spread across the table between them, and outside the Wyoming night was cold and clear and full of stars. And Clara Belrose looked at the man she had married for practical reasons, and thought about her mother and Eleanor Whitaker and Margaret Cole and 16-year-old Clara, reading documents by lamplight too late to save anything. Now, she said, I'm exactly where I want to be. Something moved through Silas's face. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The wire went to Denver the next morning. The lawyer's name was Edmund Greer, and he wired back within 48 hours, 3 sentences that said he knew exactly the kind of situation being described. He had seen it in 3 other territories. And he would be on the next available stage to Millhaven. Greer arrived 6 days later. He was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of organizational precision that made you understand immediately why he'd been practicing law for 20 years. He sat at Clara's kitchen table, which had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the operational center of everything, and read every document she'd assembled and said almost nothing for 4 hours. Then he said, Mrs. Whitaker. Yes, Clara said. This is a very clean case, he said. The federal survey record is incontestable. The 1,869 county document shows signs of alteration that a competent examination will confirm. And if the pattern holds across the other properties, he looked at her over his spectacles. Whoever did this made the mistake of being consistent. Consistent errors are provable errors. What do? Silas said. We file with the territorial court in Laramie, Greer said. We request an emergency injunction on any land or water rights transactions in this valley, pending investigation. And we submit a formal complaint about the land office clerk to the territorial governor's office. He paused. It will take time. These things always take time. But the evidence is here. He looked at Clara. Who assembled this? He said. My wife, Silas said. Greer looked at her for a moment. Mrs. Whitaker, he said. Have you considered the law? Clara almost laughed. I'm 30 years old and a ranch wife in Wyoming territory, she said. Neither of those things is permanent, Greer said mildly, and went back to his documents. The injunction was filed. The complaint went to the territorial governor's office. And 3 days after Greer rode back toward Laramie, with his case files and his spectacles and his precise handwriting, Harlan Breckett came back to Whitaker Ranch for the last time. He came with a quiet associate, Fitch, and a third man neither Clara nor Silas had seen before, a heavyset man who was introduced as a representative of the Cheyenne First National Bank and who had the look of a man who has spent his career delivering bad news and has made his peace with it. They did not look the way they had on their first visit. They look the way men look when they know the conversation is going to be different than they planned. Silas and Clara came out together. Breckett looked at the two of them standing side by side on the porch of Whitaker Ranch, and something moved through his face that was not quite resignation, but was in its vicinity. Mr. Whitaker, he said, we've become aware that you've filed with the territorial court. That's correct, Silas said. We believe there may be some misunderstanding about. Breckett, Silas said, my wife found a 14-foot discrepancy in the county record of my eastern boundary. The same boundary that runs along the creek your consortium has been planning to acquire. A federal attorney is now in Laramie filing an injunction and a formal complaint about the land office clerk who made that record. Breckett was very still. Fitch beside him said nothing. The bank representative looked at his boots. If there was an error in the county records, Breckett said carefully, I assure you the consortium had no knowledge of. I don't believe you, Clara said. Breckett looked at her. She looked back at him with the same direct, unadorned expression she'd been carrying since the day she arrived, the expression that said she had seen exactly this kind of thing before and was not impressed by any version of it. I don't believe you, she said again, and more importantly, the territorial court doesn't need to believe you. The documents speak for themselves. The silence in the yard was absolute. Then Breckett put his hat back on. We'll be in contact with our attorneys, he said. I imagine you will, Silas said. They left. The wagon rolled down the ranch road and Clara watched it go and felt, For the first time in this long fight, the particular quality of certainty that came not from winning, but from knowing that the right thing was in motion and couldn't be undone. MacCready appeared beside her. "Gone," he said. "Going," she said. "Same thing," he said. She almost smiled. Gordon Hale came out from the barn and stood in the yard and looked at the retreating wagon and then looked at Clara. "You knew," he said, "when you asked to look at those documents. You already knew what you were looking for." "I knew the shape of it," she said. "From before." "My father's farm?" he said. He'd heard enough of it to understand. Yes, he looked at the road. "You turned 20 years of losing into something," he said. "I had the right documents this time," she said, "and the right people around me." Gordon looked at her for a long moment. He tipped his hat. It was a small gesture. From Gordon Hale, it was enormous. The weeks that followed were not quiet. The legal process moved with the grinding deliberateness that territorial courts were known for. And there were letters back and forth to Greer and Laramie, and a tense 2 weeks when the consortium's attorneys filed toward that Greer addressed with the calm efficiency of a man who had seen every version of this argument and was mildly bored by it, but they were good weeks. They were the weeks in which Whitaker Ranch settled into the version of itself that Clara had been building toward since the morning. She rolled up her sleeves in front of a broken stove. The kitchen was never empty now, not in the invasive sense, not in the way that made work impossible, but in the warm, inhabited sense of a place that people moved toward when they needed to think, or needed company, or needed the particular comfort of being somewhere that someone cared about. Elliot spent his evenings there, working through Clara's recipe notebook with the seriousness of a student who has discovered his vocation. His biscuits were now genuinely excellent, and he had started experimenting with bread variations that he presented to Clara with an expression of hopeful anxiety that she always met with honest assessment and, when warranted, genuine praise. Pete Daly had become, in the space of 3 months, an entirely different person than the young man who had laughed in the yard when Clara's wagon pulled in. He worked hard, and he kept his opinions to himself unless asked, and he had developed a habit of bringing Clara small things, a piece of information from Millhaven, a question about cooking technique. Once a small bunch of dried wildflowers he'd found, pressed inside a book he was repairing, that said more about his changed understanding than any explicit acknowledgement could have. Gordon came to the kitchen every evening. He told stories about Martha. Clara told stories about her mother. And somewhere in the exchange of those two women, both gone, both present in the particular way that people are present when they have been loved well and remembered carefully, Gordon Hale and Clara Whitaker became, without either of them naming it, something close to friends. MacCready said nothing about any of this. But one evening he brought Clara a cutting from what he said was a rosemary plant he'd found growing wild along in a creek bed 3 miles from the ranch, and he presented it with the same wordless efficiency he brought to everything. And she planted it in a clay pot and put it on the kitchen windowsill, and they both understood exactly what it meant, and neither said a word about it. Carrie Fenn's ankle healed. He walked into the kitchen on the first day he was fully weight-bearing, and stood in the doorway and said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About staying," he said. "Holt and me. About whether this was always going to be a winter job or whether it might be he stopped. Whether it might be something else." Clara looked at him. "That's a conversation for you and Silas," she said. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to know what you thought first." She held his gaze. "I think," she said carefully, "that this ranch is going to be a different place in 6 months than it is today. And that the people who helped build what it's becoming have earned the right to be part of what comes next." Carrie Fenn nodded. He had the look of a young man who had been given an answer that was worth something. He talked to Silas that evening. So did Holt. By the end of the week, both Fenn brothers had signed on as permanent hands. Silas told Clara about it in the kitchen that same evening, with the particular understated satisfaction of a man who is more pleased than he intends to show. "It was the meals," he said. "It was the belonging," she said. "The meals are just how belonging gets communicated." He looked at her. "My mother again," he said. "My mother," she said. "Always." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I've been thinking about something." "All right, the Valley dinner," he said, "what it did. The way it changed things between the families here. Not just about Breckett, about everything. The way people talk to each other afterward. The way Frank Henderson and Arvis Cole have been back and forth to each other's places twice since then." "Yes," she said. "I want to make it regular," he said. "Not a crisis response." He paused. "A regular thing. Seasonal. Something people can count on." Clara looked at him. "Every season," she said. "Spring and fall at minimum," he said. "Summer if the work allows." "That's a significant commitment of resources," she said. "I know," he said. "We'd need to expand the garden," she said. "And the smokehouse capacity. And I'd need Elliot properly established as a kitchen hand, not just a helper." "Done," he said. "And a proper root cellar extension," she said. "The current one isn't large enough for what you're describing." "I'll build it," he said, "this spring." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've thought about this for a while," she said. "Since the dinner," he said. "I've thought about it every day since the dinner." Clara thought about 32 people around a table. Frank Henderson shaking Silas's hand with both of his. Margaret Cole looking across the room at her husband. Elliot saying, "I forgot food could feel like coming home." Yes, she started to stand. "Silas," she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the table, across the kitchen that had been broken and was now whole, across the 3 months that had taken her from a wagon pulling into a judgment-filled yard to this warm, inhabited place where she had made something real, and she said, "This is a good life you're building." He held her gaze. "We're building," he said. The word landed in the room with the particular weight of something that had been true for a while, and was finally being said. Clara felt it move through her the way the rosemary smell had moved through her on the first night, something old and something new at the same time. Something that was hers. "We're building," she agreed. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed cold and clear against the kitchen windows, and the ranch was quiet and tended and full of people who had chosen to stay. And Silas Whitaker and Clara Belrose Whitaker sat together in the kitchen that had brought them to each other, and for a long time neither of them needed to say anything at all. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what a life was supposed to feel like when the right people finally found the right place. And neither of them was going anywhere. The letter from Edmund Greer arrived on a Wednesday morning in early March, and McCready brought it in from Millhaven with the particular careful speed of a man who understood that some pieces of paper carried more weight than others. Clara was at the stove. Silas was at the kitchen table, going through the ranch accounts the way he did every Wednesday, with the focused concentration of a man who believed that numbers told you the truth about a place when people sometimes wouldn't. McCready set the letter on the table, without a word. Silas looked at it. He looked at the seal. He picked it up and opened it with the controlled cetistus of someone managing anticipation, rather than showing it, and he read it once without speaking, and then he read it again, and then he set it flat on the table and looked at Clara. She had turned from the stove. She was watching his face. "The injunction held," he said. The kitchen went completely still. "The consortium's counter-motion was denied," he said. "The territorial court has ordered a full examination of the county land records, going back to 1865. The land office clerk, his name was Whitfield, has been suspended pending investigation. And Greer says the governor's office has taken the complaint formally. It's in the official record now." Clara set down the ladle she was holding. Her hands were steady, but her chest was doing something she didn't have words for, something that was 20 years of carrying a specific weight, and feeling it begin, finally, to shift. "All of it?" she said. "All of it," Silas said. She sat down. Silas pushed the letter across the table to her, and she read it herself, because she needed to read it herself. Because there was a 16-year-old girl somewhere inside her who had read documents by lamplight, until her eyes burned and found nothing she could use, and that girl needed to see this with her own eyes. She read it twice. She put it down. "We need to tell the Valley," she said. "Yes," he said. "Today," she said. "McCready's already saddling up," Silas said. She looked at him. He almost smiled. I told him to the moment I read the first paragraph, he said. By mid-afternoon, every family in the valley knew. Frank Henderson came to Whitaker Ranch in person, which was not the closest place for him to be, and shook Silas's hand with both of his for the second time in 4 months, and then turned to Clara and said, with the directness of a man who had decided something was going to be said and was going to say it, "This was you." "This was all of us," Clara said. "No," Frank said. "We ate your food and felt safe enough to talk to each other. You found the paperwork problem. You knew what to do with it when you found it." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that this valley knows what you did." Clara didn't look away. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "I did what anyone would do who'd been through what I'd been through and finally had people worth doing it for." Frank looked at her for a moment. "Well," he said, roughly. "We're glad you came, Mrs. Whitaker." He left, and Clara stood in the yard in the thin March sunlight and let herself feel all of it, the weight of 20 years, the length of 3 months. The distance between the frightened 16-year-old and the woman standing on this ground, and she felt it move through her, and she let it go. Not all of it. She would never let all of it go, but enough. Enough to breathe differently. Gordon Hale found her there. He came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her face, and he said nothing for a moment, because Gordon Hale had learned, over the course of these 3 months, when words were the right tool and when they weren't. Then he said, "Martha would have said the same thing Henderson said." Clara looked at him. "She would have said it louder," he added. Clara laughed. It surprised her, the fullness of it, the way it came from somewhere uncomplicated and real, the way Gordon's face in response to it did something she had never seen it do before. He smiled, an actual, unguarded, full smile. It transformed his face entirely, and Clara understood in that moment why Martha had loved him. "Gordon," she said, "you should do that more often." "Do what?" Smile. He looked immediately uncomfortable. "Don't push it," he said. She laughed again. The Spring Valley dinner was Silas's idea made real, and it was larger than anyone planned for, because the news about the injunction had traveled through the territory with the particular speed of good news in places where good news is scarce. And 3 families from the next valley oversent word asking if they could attend, and Silas said yes before Clara had finished reading their letters. "That's 40 people," she said. He said. "The Reeves are bringing their oldest daughter and her husband." 42 people, Silas. "You said you needed the root cellar extended," he said. "I extended it. You said you needed Elliot properly established." "He's established. You said—" "I know what I said," she said. "Was I wrong to take you at your word?" She looked at him. He was completely serious, in the way Silas was completely serious about the things that mattered to him, and she understood that this dinner, this expansion of it, this invitation to more people, this deliberate building of something larger than one valley, was not a logistical problem to him. It was a statement about what he believed Whitaker Ranch was for. "No," she said. "You weren't wrong." She started the planning the next morning. The week before the spring dinner was organized chaos of the most satisfying kind. Elliot ran the kitchen with Clara from first light, his competence now so established that she could hand him entire meal components and walk away knowing they would be right. Pete Daly managed the smokehouse under Gordon's supervision with the intensity of a convert, and the things coming out of it: smoked brisket, pork shoulder rubbed with dried herbs, a whole chicken that Gordon declared the best work the smokehouse had ever produced, made the ranch smell like something that pulled people toward it from a distance. McCready coordinated the logistics of 42 people with the calm efficiency of a man in his natural element. Holt and Carrie Fenn built a long table extension that, when added to the existing configuration, could seat everyone in the main room with room to move between the chairs. Carrie's ankle was fully healed. He moved through the work with the particular physicality of a young man who has learned to appreciate the use of his body after being deprived of it. And he carried things without being asked and fixed things before they broke, and generally behaved like someone who understood that belonging to a place meant participating in its maintenance. On the night before the dinner, when the preparations were as complete as they were going to be, Clara sat at the kitchen table, with her mother's recipe notebook open in front of her, and went through the next day's menu one final time. She wasn't checking for problems. She was doing what she always did the night before something important. She was sitting with it, holding the weight of what was going to happen and making sure she was ready to carry it. Silas came in. He sat across from her. He said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, "just sitting with it." "What does that mean?" She looked up. "My mother used to do it, the night before something big. She'd go through everything one more time, not because she'd forgotten anything, but because she wanted to make sure she'd honored it properly. Made the right decisions about what mattered." Silas looked at her. "And," he said, "have you?" Clara looked at her mother's recipe notebook, at the careful handwriting, at the notes she'd added in the margins over 30 years of using these recipes, and the notes her mother had added before her, and the single recipe card in Eleanor Whitaker's slanted hand that Clara had. With great care, and after a great deal of thought, tucked into the back of the notebook 3 weeks ago, not to replace anything, but because it belonged with things that mattered. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara." Something in his voice made her look up. He was sitting forward, his hands clasped on the table, and he was looking at her with the most direct, unguarded expression she had ever seen on him, more open than the night he'd talked about Eleanor, more present than the morning after the storm, more deliberate than any of the small accumulating moments that had been building toward this one. "I have something to say," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been thinking about how to say it for approximately 6 weeks," he said. "And I've concluded that I am not a man who is going to get better at saying it with more time. So I may as well say it now and trust that you'll understand what I mean, even if the words aren't exactly right." Clara set down her pencil. She gave him her full attention. "When you came here," he said, "I told myself I was making a practical decision. That I needed the house managed, and you needed a new beginning, and that was the whole of it. And I believed that was true when I said it." He paused. "It stopped being true sometime around the 2nd week. I'm not certain exactly when. I think it might have been the night you told Macready that Eleanor's rosemary was still doing its job." Clara was very still. "I have not been easy to live with," he said. "I know that. I've been closed off and slow to speak, and I carry things longer than I should, and I don't always know how to be in a room with someone the way you deserve to be in a room with someone." He paused again. "But I want to try. I want to do better than try. And I want you to know that what you've built here, what you've built in this kitchen and in this valley and in the people on this ranch, that isn't something I could have done. That isn't something I could have imagined. And the fact that you did it here, in a place that didn't deserve you when you arrived." He stopped. He looked at his hands. Then he looked back up. "I love you, Clara," he said. "I don't say that as a duty or a formality. I say it because it's true, and because you deserve to hear true things." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Clara felt the words move through her the way the rosemary smell had on the first night. The way her mother's voice moved through her when she was doing something hard and doing it well. The way belonging felt when it was real rather than negotiated. She thought about every room she had ever walked into that wasn't ready for her. She thought about the wagon pulling into this yard, and the laughter and the weight of her one suitcase, and the decision she had made standing in this broken kitchen on the first night, that she was going to make something real here. She had made something real here, and the man sitting across the table from her, closed off and slow to speak, deliberate and private, and more careful with his words than anyone she had ever known. The man who had covered her hand with his and said, "We're building," and meant every syllable, had made something real, too. "Silas," she said. "Yes, I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I just wasn't sure it was mine to say yet." He looked at her. "It was yours to say," he said. "It was yours for a long time." She nodded. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same way he had weeks ago, and this time she turned her hand over and held his back. They sat like that for a long moment. Then Clara said, "The dinner tomorrow is going to be remarkable." "I know," he said. And afterward, she said, "I want to plant the garden properly." The spring planting, I want to expand it, more herbs, more winter vegetables, room for things we don't have yet. I'll build the beds, he said, whatever you need. And I want to teach a proper cooking class, she said. Not just Elliot and Pete, anyone in the valley who wants to come. The Henderson girl, Margaret Cole, if she wants to. Anyone, yes, he said. She stopped. He waited. I want to put Eleanor's recipe card in a frame, she said carefully. And hang it in the kitchen, not to replace anything. Just so it's there, so she's here. He was very still. Clara, she's part of what this kitchen is, she said. Her rosemary is in the pot right now. Her dried thyme is in the jar on the second shelf. Her recipe for the apple cake is in the back of my mother's notebook because I put it there 3 weeks ago, because I thought it belonged with things that mattered. She held his gaze. I would like her to be honored in this kitchen openly. You'll allow it. Silas looked at her for a long time. His jaw worked. His eyes did something they very rarely did. Yes, he said when he trusted his voice, I'd like that too. Clara nodded. She squeezed his hand once. She picked up her pencil and looked at the menu. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow is going to be a long, good day. He stood. He pushed his chair in. At the kitchen door he stopped, the way he always stopped, and turned back, the way he sometimes did. Clara, he said. Silas, thank you, he said, for coming here. Thank you for making it worth coming to, she said. He left, and Clara sat in the kitchen that had been broken and was now whole. With her mother's recipe notebook open and Eleanor Whitaker's handwriting tucked carefully in the back. Spring dinner menu laid out in front of her, and the rosemary plant on the windowsill that Macready had found. And she had kept growing. And she felt the weight of everything this place had become, and she held it without flinching. The spring dinner was everything it was supposed to be, and more than anyone expected. 42 people came, and then 43 when Dr. Reeve arrived unannounced with a bottle of good whiskey, and the explanation that he'd heard there was a dinner at Whitaker Ranch, and he'd been coming to this ranch for emergencies for 20 years, and he reckoned it was time he came for something good. Clara put him to work immediately. He turned out to have strong opinions about bread and no practical ability to make it, which made him useful as a commentator and useless as an assistant, and Elliot managed him with the patient diplomacy of a young man who had learned, in 3 months of Clara's kitchen, how to receive unsolicited opinions without either agreeing with them or creating conflict. The food came out in the same waves as the winter dinner, but larger Gordon's smokehouse at its peak, Elliot's bread in 4 varieties. Pete Daly's roasted vegetables that he had been working on for weeks and that came to the table with a complexity of seasoning that made Clara genuinely proud when she tasted them, and the centerpiece stew with its rosemary and thyme, and the slow, careful depth of a dish that had been building since before dawn. But this time, Clara came out of the kitchen. She had spent every valley dinner before this one behind the stove. This time, Elliot ran the final service, and Clara walked out into the room of 43 people and stood for a moment taking it in. The noise of it, the warmth. 43 people who had been frightened and isolated and manipulated and were now sitting together in the knowledge that they had faced something together and were still standing. Margaret Cole caught her eye across the room. Margaret raised her coffee cup slightly. Clara raised hers back. Arvis Cole, beside his wife, was talking to Frank Henderson with the animated ease of a man who has put down something heavy and discovered how much lighter his own voice sounds when he's not carrying it. The Farthings' youngest child was asleep in a chair in the corner, having eaten approximately her own body weight in cornbread and yielded to the inevitable. Gordon Hale was telling a story at the far end of the table, and people were laughing real laughter, the kind that required trust, and in the middle of the laughter, Gordon looked up and found Clara's eyes across the room and did it again. Smiled, unguarded, full, she smiled back. Silas appeared beside her. He was not a man who did public affection, but he stood close enough that their arms touched, and for Silas Whitaker that was a statement. Look at this, he said quietly. I know, she said. This is what you built, he said. We built, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to ask you something. Formally, She looked at him. They were standing in a room of 43 people, and he was looking at her with an expression of such deliberate intention that several people nearby had gone slightly quieter. "We're already married," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "But I want to ask you something that isn't in the arrangement." The room had gotten quieter. Not entirely, it was still full of conversation and children and the scrape of chairs, but in their immediate vicinity, people had developed the sixth sense of people who understand that they are witnessing something they should give space to. "Clara Belrose Whitaker," Silas said, in his plain, deliberate voice that never wasted a word, "I would like to ask you to choose to stay here. Not because we made an arrangement, not because the ranch needs managing, or the kitchen needs running, or the valley needs organizing, though all of those things are true. But because I would like you to stay here because you want to. Because this is your home." He paused. "Because I am asking you." The room was very quiet now. Elliot, in the kitchen doorway, had stopped moving entirely. Pete Daly was staring at the floor with the intense non-expression of a young man working very hard not to show that he was affected by something. Gordon Hale had his arms folded and was looking at the table with a face that said he was thinking about Martha. McCready was nowhere visible, which meant he was absolutely present and choosing not to be seen. Clara looked at Silas. She thought about the wagon pulling into the yard. The laughter, the judgment, the broken kitchen, and the almost empty shelves and the rosemary that had been waiting 7 years in the cellar. She thought about her mother saying, "A kitchen is where you remind people they matter." She thought about 16-year-old Clara reading documents by lamplight, and 29-year-old Clara stepping down from a wagon into the sound of laughter, and 30-year-old Clara standing in this room that she had made into the warm, inhabited, fighting heart of a valley. She thought, "I have been walking toward this kitchen my whole life." "Yes," she said. The word was simple. It was also the most complete thing she had ever said. Something moved through Silas's face, not quite relief, because he was not a man who showed relief, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as it, and was warmer. He took her hand, not the careful covered hand gesture from across the table. He took her hand, the way you take someone's hand when you are done being careful about it. Someone at the far end of the table, Clara never found out who started clapping. And then 43 people in the main room of Whitaker Ranch were clapping, and the Farthing's youngest child woke up alarmed and then went back to sleep, and Dr. Reeve said something to the man next to him that made 3 people laugh, and Elliot in the kitchen doorway finally moved again, and Pete Daly looked up from the floor with red eyes and immediately looked back down. And Gordon Hale unfolded his arms and clapped twice firmly with the deliberateness of a man making a statement. Clara stood in the middle of all of it with Silas's hand in hers and felt the particular fullness of a moment that has been earned, not given, not stumbled into, but built, carefully and with great effort, from the ground up. That evening, after the families had gone, and the kitchen was cleaned and the tables were restored, and the ranch had settled into its nighttime quiet, Clara went to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. She heard Silas come in behind her. She didn't turn. "The rosemary needs repotting," she said. "It's outgrown the clay pot." "I'll build a proper planter," he said, "in the spring garden." "Along the south fence," she said, "where Eleanor grew it." "Yes," he said. She turned. He was standing in the kitchen, in the warm lamplight, and he was home, not performing home, not enduring home, but actually, completely, simply home, and so was she. "I'm going to write to Mrs. Crane," Clara said, "the woman in Kansas who arranged this." "And tell her what?" Silas said. "That she did something right," Clara said. "She deserves to know." He almost smiled. "Send her one of Elliot's biscuits," he said. "That'll tell her more than a letter." Clara laughed. She picked up her mother's recipe notebook from the counter and held it against her chest. She thought about everything it contained, her mother's voice in every measurement and instruction, Eleanor Whitaker's apple cake in the back, her own notes in the margins building on both of them. 3 women, 3 kitchens, one continuous act of feeding people and meaning it. She thought about the ranch that had laughed when she arrived, and had chosen her when she stayed. She thought about a valley that had almost been taken apart, and was instead more whole than it had been before anyone tried. She thought about Gordon Hale's smile and Elliot's bread, and Pete Daly's apology, and Carrie Fenn's hand holding hers in the back room, and McCready's rosemary cutting, and the tint box with the recipe cards, and the 14-foot record that she had found because she had spent 20 years making sure she would know how to find it. She thought about Silas Whitaker standing in a room of 43 people and asking her to stay because he wanted her there. She had spent her entire life walking into rooms that weren't ready for her. She had walked into this one and made it ready herself. And now it was hers not by arrangement, not by necessity, not by the careful negotiation of two practical people who needed things from each other, but by choice, by love. By the irreversible accumulation of every meal, and every conversation, and every document, and every clapping hand, and every sprig of rosemary that had led. With the purposeful logic of things that were always meant to find each other, to this kitchen, this man, this life. Clara Belrose had arrived at Whitaker Ranch with one suitcase and the judgment of strangers and 20 years of loss carried quietly, and a knowledge of kitchens that ran all the way down to her bones. She had turned all of it into something that would outlast every single person who had ever laughed at her. And she was never, not for a single day of the rest of her long and full and extraordinary life, going to be invisible again.